As journalists, we are trying to show, not tell, in our reporting. Before telling you about ourselves and CIC, we'll open by showing an example of how CIC tells underreported stories of social injustices via music and film.
More than 5 million people have had to flee the devastating effects of the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. It is a forced migration because in most of the country there is no access to water, electricity or food. Every day, hundreds of people cross the border into Colombia on foot. These migrants, known as caminantes, walk hundreds of kilometers seeking a path to survival. The authoritarian government of Venezuela censors and persecutes journalists whose reporting defies the official state messaging about this crisis. Many brave journalists fight now to offer information at this time in the country.
For centuries, stories of journeys were documented via the arts, painted on cave walls, recited by bards in epic poems, and composed by troubadours in music. As contemporary storytellers, we tell underreported stories of social injustices via the arts, via music and film. We tell them to create awareness in audiences today and to preserve these stories for future generations. With collaborative investigative composing, we tell these stories via the carillon or bell tower. The sound of the bells can travel for up to 2 miles away, so we have audiences we can't even see. Bell towers originally and the sound of the bell served for communities as timekeepers and as messengers. I asked Marielba which themes or sounds would best depict the caminante's journey. While she plays the themes on the carillon, I document them in music notation and color code them to develop later.
During this part, I am trying to imitate the rhythm of the caminantes during the walking. And now we are trying to tell when they encounter violence.
Through many drafts of the Caminante's composition, I continue to develop Marielba's walking and violence themes as I compose the rest of the music.
Grandmothers walk, children walk, young mothers walk and carry their babies. Due to the policies of the authoritarian government, Venezuelans no longer have access to critical information, nor to basic services, nor to gasoline. Prices escalated, jobs disappeared, violence increased. People don't want to leave their homeland, but to survive, they have to flee. In their path from the border of Venezuela to some of the main cities of Colombia, the caminantes have to climb the Andes and cross the Berlin Paramo, a very dry and cold section of the mountains, often without adequate shoes or clothes, and with limited food and water. This makes the already dangerous journey into Colombia more difficult.
Collaborative investigative composing is like unraveling a tapestry. Every time I meet with Marielba, there are more threads of the story to unravel, and then to continue composing Caminantes. As an artist, it's essential to me to document these stories accurately and to get at the emotions and feelings involved. So I ask the journalists sensorial questions such as, what color would depict the feeling of this story? What does comfort smell like? What does violence sound like?
The caminantes still have no choice but to continue walking. It is the will to survive. It is the will to have a life.
At CIC, we tell underreported stories of social injustice by music, film, and dance. It is vitally important to us to ensure that silenced voices are heard, to perform these stories to generate awareness and a call to action in our time, and to preserve the stories for future generations. In all our stories, we also bring out the resilience, agency, and gifts the protagonists offer to the world. Having one's voice heard and respected is an essential component to belonging, which in turn is vital to well-being.
Our esteemed CIC journalists are trained to present information from multiple perspectives, fact-checking all along the way. The founding journalists are Marielba Núñez from Venezuela and Jet Schouten from the Netherlands. They came as Knight Wallace Fellows to the University of Michigan, as did Tracie Mauriello and Ana Avila. Marielba and Jet signed up for carillon lessons after I presented on the carillon about storytelling, because they realized that the carillon could help tell stories that were censored, for instance, in Venezuela, or that were too difficult to tell in words alone, as was the case in one of Jet's stories. As the CIC founding journalist Marielba, Jet, and I learned in the early days of CIC, both facts and feelings are important in communicating stories of diverse communities and their journey to belong. Most often, our first version of a CIC story is for the carillon, or bell tower, and from there I compose CICs for solo organ and for instrumental and choral ensembles. As a public instrument without the socioeconomic barriers of ticket costs, the carillon can play a critical role in welcoming diverse voices and fostering belonging. In their 2021 International Carillon Conference presentation, Australian carillonists Dr. Grace Chan and Dr. Anna Wong described the carillon's potential role in supporting a community's well-being and identity. Concepts such as social connectedness and inclusion, cultural participation, and a sense of belonging are becoming increasingly important factors for a city's health and success. Key outcomes of this policy approach include good physical and mental health of a population to alleviate the burden of chronic disease and antisocial behavior. As an example, they cited CIC's Healing Bells, the piece that Yad Schouten and I co-composed in response to the onset of the pandemic.
We had just received word that the University of Michigan was about to close its campus. International borders were shutting down and our fellows needed to get back home, yet needed to get back to Amsterdam. It was the day before her flight, and she was supposed to be packing, but inspiration struck. She found herself clambering up the 10 floors of Burton Tower to compose with Pamela. She felt compelled to memorialize through music the quarantine, the fear, and the uncertainty of the time. I was at the tower when Yet and Pamela began, but they kept going for hours and hours after I left. At the time of the Black Plague, people believed that the vibrations of bells had healing powers. Yet and Pamela wanted their music to reach all the places in the world that needed healing. 2 months after they began that day in the tower, Healing Bells was co-premiered by carillonists on 6 continents at the UNESCO World Heritage Day of Cultural Diversity, Dialogue, and Development.
Through the co-premiere, the musicians themselves felt embraced by the carillon community, despite being physically isolated and distanced. Belgian carillonist and historian Luc Rumbouts gathered and posted global videos of Healing Bells on the Leuven War Memorial and Peace Carillons Facebook page. Yet listen to the premiere by Boudewijn's Fort on the Westerkerk Carillon in Amsterdam. The same bells Anne Frank described hearing every day from her attic hideaway. The morning of the May 21 premiere of Healing Bells, Yet wrote a letter of inspiration to me. With her permission, we'll share just a brief portion.
The venture you and I went on together is a very new role for me as a journalist. Not to fight for once with government or big pharma, not to point at the ugly side of humankind, but to look at beauty, art, and to spread a message of hope.
After Yet engaged in CIC work here at the University of Michigan, she was determined to continue her carillon studies. She's currently enrolled at the Royal Carillon School in Mechelen, Belgium, and is writing a book about bicycling to each of the nearly 200 carillons in the Netherlands.
As another founding member of CIC, Marielba was working on her own pieces with Pamela. Here, you see photos of journalists and friends protesting the lack of free speech in Venezuela.
In recent years, in my country, Venezuela, we have experienced media closures, continuous restrictions of free speech, growing censorship of journalists, many of whom have had to go into exile, and the growth of information deserts, places news never reaches. The digital world is not a refuge or an alternative due to continuous service failures, as well as, for most people, inaccessible internet. Amid this difficult panorama, journalists have been forced to look for alternatives to communicate the reality that people experience, that is very different of the official version that the government is trying to impose through communicational hegemony. This imposition from an authoritarian government of what one is allowed to say or what should be said is something that I consider the lost voice. That is, a feeling that you are not longer allowed to speak about the reality that surrounds you. Venezuela is in a complex humanitarian emergency where most people are denied even the bare minimum, such as clean water or food. This emergency is not caused by a natural catastrophe, nor by a war. It's caused by the destruction of democracy. Traditional news genres often seem insufficient to transmit what is happening or to reach everyone who needs to know what is happening. In these circumstances, art can provide a remedy to this impossibility to communicate pain, suffering, or the courage to survive. A couple of years ago, I began exploring documentary poetry, a form of poetic expression based on archives, journalistic, and historical text. That same year, thanks to the Nye Wallace Fellowship for Journalists, I came to the University of Michigan and I learned about the work of Pamela on music and social injustices. I felt that everything was connected with that idea that I was exploring to look for new ways of journalistic expression and journalistic narration, especially to tell about the story of my country. As we began to collaborate, 3 pieces were born. La Boca del Dragón is a piece about human trafficking, which premiered in this conference this morning. Caminantes is a piece about forced migration, and Llanto de Tepuyes depicts the destruction of a natural protected area in Venezuela. We have talked in the team about what collaborative investigative composing can contribute. It can connect with the emotion of the person doing the investigation, with the emotion underlying the events that are narrated. CIC can create more empathy towards urgent human issues. Also, CIC can preserve the memory of events that run the risk of being erased over time, or by the imposition of an hegemonic discourse, by censorship, or by persecution. These stories are simultaneously universal and nervy. The girl who disappeared in the wreck of a small boat. The family that crosses a border on foot because they don't have other way to emigrate. Or the tree cut down in a forest ravaged by the search of gold.
In this majestic Gran Sabana in the Canaima region of Venezuela, Tepuyes are the flat-topped mountains you see at the horizon. Our CIC piece, Llanto de Tepuyes, refers to the tears of the Tepuyes Mountains as they weep for Canaima. In Llanto de Tepuyes, Marielba improvised the opening theme on the carillon's equivalent to the black notes on the piano. The pentatonic results are pleasing and effectively depict Canaima's vast waterfalls. The unique species of animals, birds, flora, and fauna, as well as the indigenous Pemon people displaced by gold mining, are also represented. Loud pedal trills represent the excavators that destroyed the ecosystem.
The migrant experience plays out in the U.S., too, with diverse individualized stories. Our largest scale CIC work is an oratorio called Mother of Exiles. Journalist Eileen Truax interviewed migrants at the Mexico-U.S. border, and Diego Sedano filmed the interviews. I interviewed an immigrant mother and son in Pittsburgh. We wanted to document the stories that exist before and after the moment of the border crossing to counterbalance the narratives dominating news cycles. We often heard of immigrants dubbed as criminals, but seldom of their quest to belong or find a safe place to raise their children. We often heard of gang members and rapists, but seldom of young mothers who entered the U.S. dehydrated and with bleeding feet, or the thousands of tenacious workers who grow the food we eat. We didn't know about Adriana and Pablo, who were too afraid of deportation to apply to stay under DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. We didn't know about Jorge, who faced the double bias of being both gay and undocumented. And we didn't know about Odilia, a Zapotec woman who transformed disadvantages into agency. She created a translation service for indigenous immigrants in the U.S. who suffered abuses in courts and hospitals because they understood neither English nor Spanish. We didn't know about Doña Sara, who was so determined to stay in Mexico and fight corruption until 4 of her children and a grandchild were murdered in the government's attempt to silence her. Here's Doña Sara in her own words, filmed by CIC filmmaker Diego Sedano.
Me mataron a mis hijos. Primero a Josefina, primero mi nieto, Julio César Reyes. Luego mi hija Josefina Reyes, Rubén y Elías y María Magdalena. Siempre anduve con ellos en todo lo que hacíamos, en defensa de los desprotegidos. Comenzamos a protestar, a decir, a gritar, a juntar gente para exigir que sacaran los soldados. Pero comenzaron a caer mis hijos. Lo último que fue más duro para mí fue el secuestro de Elías y Malena. Íbamos de Juárez para Guadalupe. Una camioneta salió de por acá y se nos puso enfrente así. Se bajaron corriendo los sicarios, pusieron con las armas, apuntándonos. Y ya no, a mí nomás me dio un aventón y se subió a la camioneta y se fueron. Se los llevaron. Enfrenté al gobernador en México y le grité que quería que me entregara a mis hijos vivos, que él sabía quién los tenía, que él era el patrón de todos los asesinos. Le dije tú eres un títere de Calderón, tú haces lo que él te dice. Yo le grité muchas cosas. No podía contestar, no podía decir nada, no decía nada él, no decía nada. Otro día a las 8 de la mañana me hablan que ya los habían encontrado. ¿Sí? ¿Qué quiere decir? El gobernador sabía. Los recuperamos, fuimos y los sepultamos a Guadalupe. Fuimos y los sepultamos. A los 6 días de que se llevaron a mis hijos, me quemaron mi casa. Y siempre ya al teléfono de uno de mis nietos, al teléfono de otro, al teléfono de mi hija, siempre eran las mismas amenazas. Si no se callan, ustedes siguen. Y ya sabemos dónde están. Entonces, el exilio es nomás una protección. ¿sí? Aquí te vamos a proteger de tu país y total.
I have a confession to make. When I first watched Doña Sara's video and heard her words, I approached it, or I thought I was approaching it, as a composer who was collaborating with these journalists about this story. But as soon as she started talking, I was listening to her as a mother. And as a mother, I was outraged that Doña Sara's children were murdered. And I poured these feelings into her aria. Ay, mis hijos, ay, mis hijos. I wrote for a soprano who would scream her outrage in a piercingly high register. When I sang and played the aria for Eileen and Diego, Eileen immediately exclaimed, "Oh no, 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 we can't do that." They explained that a well-known tragic legend in Mexico feeds on children's and parents' worst nightmares. In Latin American folklore, La Llorona is a spirit who roams shorelines, weeping for her children whom she drowned. In the legend, La Llorona steals children, and she wails the exact text I unknowingly set for Doña Sara. Ay, mis hijos, ay, mis hijos. I was dumbfounded at the enormous mistake I would have made had we not been collaborating with journalists who have lived experience. I continue to carry this life lesson as a compass in my DEI arts work. I don't know what I don't know about cultures that are not my own. In our CIC collaborations, we rely on each other to ensure that the stories are told and presented accurately and sensitively. Thanks to advice from Eileen, Diego, and Tracie, I reworked the aria to reflect Doña Sara's whispered grief response to the loss of her children and her deep anger at the governor of Chihuahua, Cesar Duarte, whom she believed to be complicit in the murders. This time, Eileen and Diego confirmed that the music matched Doña Sara's story.
Reporting on tragedy takes a toll on journalists. We experience secondhand trauma and rarely have a safe venue to process it. Instead, we move on to the next story, which might be just as traumatic. One of Ana Avila's positions in Mexico was working for a women's rights organization against gender violence. Ana courageously shared her own story of domestic violence, including the agency it took for her to leave an abusive relationship.
I need to cry a bit.
Yeah, do.
Okay. I'm ready. When the Me Too movement arrived to Mexico, I read a tweet about another woman who suffered the same with the same man as I did. When I met this man, I was working at an NGO. He is an expert in human rights and violence and security issues. I admire him a lot. He was speaking about a non-violent approach, and I was really, really attracted to that. One day we started dating. I don't know exactly how. It was a long time ago, but we started going out. When we were dating, there were red flags I didn't see. I see them now. I couldn't bear thinking that he could leave me. And I begged and I cried, and he didn't talk to me. He used silence as a source of violence. He said like I was dead soil and nothing could grow on me. There was no fertility in me, like creativity or intellectual work. I was dead. Like he used to say this, and it had a huge impact. And I felt dead. I felt like it was true. I was empty. I applied for a Fulbright scholarship and I won it. I told him I was going to leave, and I was proud of myself. And also working there and studying and raising my daughter, I felt like there was some worth in me, and he couldn't get in there that easy anymore. I was becoming stronger. I went to the police station one night after he threatened me and he said he was going to hurt my daughter. But every day they receive like around 400 women. I was thinking like, if 400 women come here every day to the police station, if we multiply this on a daily basis, how about a month? And this is my city. How about other cities? How about the women that don't show up to the police station? How about the women that decided to stay quiet? This is like thousands of people. I broke the silence and I broke the isolation. So I'm doing this because I think we can create a healthier community if we speak up, we share, and we heal together. I decided to share my story when the Me Too movement arrived in my home country, Mexico. When I learned that another woman's story was like mine, the same man, the same MO, the same results, I decided to go public. I needed to tell her that she wasn't crazy, that she wasn't alone. The most positive outcome was the collective healing, which included mine, of course. Women started writing to me and asking for help. I had a document with shelters, pro bono lawyers, therapy support groups, and I was ready to be there for them. In every phone call, in every coffee, when I listened to their stories and I shared mine, I overcame the pain, the shame. Breaking the isolation has a healing power. Acknowledging other women's pain was acknowledging mine. I saw myself in them, and they in me. My healing also came in the process of writing. My professional work has become an expression of who I am, and writing is how I process trauma. I was lucky enough to publish my story in a media outlet because my editor prepared a special space where women in the newsroom could share their stories. I was lucky to have a national platform to share, even though I feared what the man who hurt me could do, or what some friends or strangers would think. The benefits of sharing are present here. I can show you how violence against women feels. I became a stronger version of myself. And then the music came. Music needs no translation. Music offers cultural gifts. Music can bring out our shared humanity and speak to our collective trauma and collective healing. Gender violence gains ground in silence. Predators isolate their victims and create a shield to separate them from loved ones. The process takes time, and it progresses to the point in which the victim believes there is no one else in the world close to them but the abuser. The return to the community is a long journey, and it's not an easy one. In every step of my legal and emotional process, I had female friends that walked with me, and I owe them my life. When I decided to speak up, my wounds weren't completely healed. That came with I published my story. Working with Pamela, I'm creating a new path to healing and connecting with other women. The music finds a way through our feelings to share the stories, keep them alive, and make them visible. 1 in every 3 women in the United States suffers from gender violence, sexual harassment, or abuse. It's normalized and embedded in our lives. Structural problems become invisible. CIC's intention is continuously to make visible structural problems that have become normalized and invisible. Agencia Creciente is a story about how from being a victim, I moved on to become a survivor with agency. When I broke the isolation and recovered, I work in a gender rights organization. My feminist friends gave me shelter. One day, one of them was sexually abused inside the moving subway train car, and I was outraged. In Mexico's machismo culture, men had been sexually harassing and abusing women in Mexico City Metro for years. And it was time to stand up. That's when Metro Asphyxia comes. A new collective healing process started. I transitioned from powerlessness to agency. I organized with my friends a demonstration in the subway. We took the metro lines, all dressed in baggy black gowns with posters that said, "Do I have to dress like this so you won't touch me?" Or "The subway is public, my body isn't."
In Metro Asphyxia, the CIC music imitates the sound of the subway cars jostling along the tracks, complete with squealing brakes and amidst cries for help. Then the music transitions to the agency Anna and her friends demonstrated, with chants that syllabically enunciate the words on the placards they carried.
The media were there, and thanks to social media, we live-streamed our demonstration. The government responded. They wanted to take measures to stop the violence. Instead of holding men accountable, the government gave the women whistles and set up a small stands in the metro where women could file complaints that went nowhere. These measures merely served to give a pretense of government action. Women worked for change, and some superficial changes were made, but they are still fighting. We have witnessed that through the process of storytelling, creating music, and sharing trauma experiences, there is collective healing. The journalism techniques sustained with accuracy, impartiality, transparency, fact-checking, compassion, and ethics give agency to individuals respecting their human rights. In an interview for the Harvard Gazette, Thomas Howell, expert on healing collective trauma, says that when we come to the place of restoration, there's a kind of illumination, a self-healing mechanism that heals the tissue of life. And I believe that collective healing will support individual healing and help us learn even more about individual health.
So often, journalists parachute in the middle of a news event. It's a high-pressure job, and one that can give us the reputation that we exploit people's worst moments and then disappear again to move on to the next thing. It's easy to forget that the people we are writing about had lives before the news event and will have lives, often much different ones, after. The news event is not the end of the story, but it's where we often leave our audiences. I'd like to tell you how our team of collaborative investigative composers is attempting to fill the void. And the best way to do that is to give you an example. On December 14th, 2012, reporters from around the world descended into Newtown, Connecticut. I was among them. I reported on the victims of the Sandy Hook massacre, the survivors, the shooter, the family, the clergy, the global response, and a presidential call to action that ultimately went nowhere. Just ask Oxford High School here in Michigan. 6 months after the Newtown shooting, I was on a flight between Washington, D.C. and Connecticut. By pure happenstance, I wound up sitting next to Jeremy Richmond. His daughter Avila was killed at Sandy Hook. We talked the whole flight. This man had a whole life before and after December 14th, 2012, but all most people knew him as was the face of a distraught father that flashed on their television screens for days and weeks after the tragedy. In that 2-hour plane ride, I saw how much more than that he was. Jeremy connected me with several other Sandy Hook families who demonstrated inconceivable resilience and in some cases forgiveness. It astounded me that these people could ever pull themselves out of the depths of the worst tragedy that could befall a parent. One of the people I met through Jeremy was Scarlett Lewis, whose son Jesse was killed. She opened her heart and her home to a photographer and me and showed us how life does go on. When someone trusts you enough to share the worst moment of her life with you, a journalist feels extraordinary pressure to find the words to do justice to the story. I did my best, but it didn't feel like enough. Years later, when Pamela invited me to collaborate with her, I knew exactly what story I wanted to tell: Scarlett's. We'd been in touch sporadically since I visited her back on her farm in 2013. She agreed to be part of the collaboration.
Here are some excerpts of the Nurturing Healing Love music, which captures Jesse's gentle play with rubber ducks and his ardent work marching around the perimeter of the farm, guarding the farm while wearing camouflage snow boots, no matter the weather.
The title of the piece came from a message Scarlett found on the chalkboard in her kitchen right after Jesse died. It was his final message to her. You can see the chalkboard on the top right here. Nurturing Healing Love, spelled phonetically, as only a 6-year-old can. In the lower left line of the music, you'll see that a low bell chimes 29 times, once for each of the Sandy Hook victims. The 29th bell is for Jeremy, who is so bereft that he took his own life in 2019. The piece concludes with a representation of the hope that lives on in Scarlett. She founded a nonprofit in her son's name. Through Jessie Lewis Choose Love, Scarlett and her team have mentored adults and children in 110 countries, teaching them to choose love instead of bullying. Per Scarlett's request, the concluding Choose Love theme is laced with wisps of angels we have heard on high. Scarlett worked with Pamela to shape the piece so the emotions it evoked were authentic to her. Our sources' participation in the creation of our work is essential to CIC and what sets it apart from journalism. Although our work is based on sound journalistic practices, it is not the sole creation of people who parachute in to tell other people's stories.
In creating CIC, we talk a lot about positionality. It is important to us that we aren't just telling other people's stories, but that we are providing a pathway for them to tell their own. These are their stories, not ours. We are lending our words, music, and visual expertise, but the story is the center of everything we do. The story always comes first.
Thank you.